With that list of transactions available, let's output the transactions. And for that, here, instead of that second card, which is a placeholder for that list of transactions, I want to have the actual list of transactions. So since we have more than one transaction, we need a widget that can hold more than one widget, because each transaction, here in our list of transactions, should be mapped into a widget that outputs the data of that transaction. Now, which widget can we use if we have more than one widget? A column. So here in the column, we add the children key, and again, now we can, well, output our different transactions. Now, each transaction might now be a card. So therefore, we could add a card here and now populate it with data for the first transaction, and then add a second card and populate that with the data of the second transaction. But this approach would have a flaw. Do you know which? Well, we as a developer would have to hard code as many cards as we have transactions. And whilst we know how many transactions we have at the moment, because the transactions are hard coded too, later the transactions will be dynamic because the users of our application will add them. So we don't know in advance how many cards we need. So in the end, our goal should be to take our transactions list and map that into a list of widgets. We did this earlier. So here, children will now not be an array like this, but instead here I'll point at transactions, which is my list of transaction objects, and there we can use the map method to transform this list of objects into a list of widgets. Widgets technically also are objects, but you get my point. Keep in mind you need to call toList here at the end because map will always give you an iterable, which you need to transform to a list. But right now there is nothing to transform. Map doesn't do anything. You might remember that map takes a function which automatically gets executed on every element in that list. So in this case, on every transaction. So what we get here is a single transaction, and I'll name it TX here just as an abbreviation. So we get a transaction here as an input to this function we pass to map, and this function, again, executes on every transaction in here. And we need to return a new element here. And that new element, of course, should be a widget that represents our transaction. And there we could use a card with a child. And for now, let's simply output the title of the transaction. And we'll output the rest later. So here we get our card with our text in there. And the text, of course, should be drawn from the transaction we have. And in there, I want to access the title. That's, by the way, the convenient thing of using a custom class and object instead of a map for our transactions. Here I get nice auto-completion as soon as I type a dot to access the different properties of this object. I don't have to use title as we did it for a map. So here I output my title, and with that we actually already transform our list of transactions to a list of cards where each card outputs the title of the transaction. If we save that, our application is taking shape and we see the two titles here. Now, of course, a transaction should be more than a tiny card with no spacing at all inside of it, and then the title. So let's work on how we output a single transaction in the next lecture.